Freddy Owens. He's set to die at 6 p.m. tomorrow at a Columbia prison. This will be the first execution in South Carolina since 2011.
He said he was innocent. But tonight, Freddy Owens put to death for the killing of a convenience store clerk in South Carolina.
I've just learned Freddy Owens has been put to death by lethal injection.
Whether you believe Robert Robertson is guilty or innocent, his case reveals a justice system caught between science and certainty. It asks us, what is the cost of being wrong? Because in the death penalty, there's no second chance. If justice is blind, it must also be sure, and in this case, many are not. Halloween night, 1997. Irene Graves, a single mother working the overnight shift at a Speedway gas station, was shot in the head during a robbery. According to the prosecution, Freddy Owens and a co-defendant entered the store, and Owens pulled the trigger. But for years, Owens denied being the shooter. No physical evidence placed him at the scene, only a now controversial testimony from his accomplice. Despite these questions, a jury convicted Owens of capital murder in 1999.
Back in 1997, Owens was convicted of murder, armed robbery, and criminal conspiracy for the murder of Irene Graves.
While on death row, Owens was involved in another killing, this time of a cellmate, further complicating any claims for clemency. But in 2024, shocking new statements emerged. His co-defendant, Stephen Golden, signed a sworn affidavit recanting his original testimony, admitting he lied and claiming Owens wasn't even at the gas station that night. Owens's legal team raced to halt the execution, but the courts, including the U.S. Supreme Court, denied his appeals.
Freddy Owens is not the person who shot Irene Graves.
Despite last-minute legal maneuvers, the clock was ticking. Protesters gathered, petitions were delivered to the governor's office, and still, South Carolina prepared for its first execution in 13 years. Owens left the decision of how to die to his lawyer, who chose lethal injection. On September 20th, 2024, Freddy Owens was executed by lethal injection. He made no final statement. Governor McMaster had denied clemency just hours before, and the state Supreme Court refused a stay of execution. Irene Graves' daughter Inslee was present, seeking closure after 27 long years. She said, "I'm looking to breathe again." Owens was pronounced dead at 6:55 p.m.
Owens began receiving drugs through an IV around 6:30 Friday night and was pronounced dead 20 minutes later at 6:55 p.m.
The execution sparked renewed debate. Civil rights groups decried the act as state-sponsored revenge. Over 10,000 people had signed petitions urging clemency. Advocates pointed to racial disparities. 74% of those executed in South Carolina since 1929 were black. For many, Owens's execution symbolized a justice system unwilling to reckon with doubt. Inside the death chamber, witnesses described Owens as calm, even showing a faint smile. Journalists noted he remained conscious for nearly a minute after the drugs entered his system, then slowly faded. For Irene's daughter, watching was a moment of complicated closure. She still couldn't say with certainty if Owens was guilty, but she hoped justice had been served.
Irene Graves' son and son-in-law were both there watching Owens as he died. Collins explains how Owens seemed prior to his death.
Freddy Owens is now gone, but questions linger about justice, about truth, about how many others might be one recanted statement away from death. In South Carolina, the machine of capital punishment has roared back to life, and with it comes a haunting question: who's next? Imagine sitting on death row for over 2 decades, condemned for a crime that DNA evidence says you didn't commit. That's the reality for Marcellus Khalifa Williams, a man whose case has become a flashpoint in the debate over wrongful convictions, prosecutorial misconduct, and the death penalty in America. Despite overwhelming forensic evidence suggesting his innocence, Missouri was prepared to carry out his execution.
I hope a miracle happens, you know what I'm saying? I hope it's, all I wish is to free my father from abundant enslavement and spare his life.
In 1998, Felicia Gale, a former journalist, was found stabbed to death in her home. The crime scene was brutal. There were signs of forced entry, stolen items, and a knife left embedded in the victim. Over a year later, after a $10,000 reward was offered, 2 informants, one a jailhouse snitch and the other a girlfriend, claimed that Williams had confessed. These testimonies, despite being incentivized with cash, became the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. There was no physical evidence linking Williams to the murder, no fingerprints, no matching DNA, just stories bought and sold.
Several people came forward basically saying that Khalifa had confessed to killing this victim.
Over the years, Williams maintained his innocence and became a devout Muslim, known in prison as Imam Khalifa. His legal team tirelessly fought for his exoneration, especially after DNA testing in 2015 revealed that none of the biological evidence matched him. In fact, later tests showed the DNA on the murder weapon belonged to the original prosecutor and his investigator, proof of contamination. Yet, the courts ruled that this wasn't clear and convincing enough to overturn his conviction.
Interestingly enough, the DNA came back to match them. So what that told the current prosecutor's office is that the evidence was contaminated. Right?
Despite efforts from his lawyers, activists, and religious leaders, a final ruling in August 2024 denied the motion to vacate his conviction. The execution was rescheduled for September 24th. The clock was ticking, and justice was running out. On September 24, 2024, Marcellus Khalifa Williams was executed in Missouri. He declined a final meal. In his last words, he spoke with peace and conviction, quoting the Prophet Muhammad, "If life is good for me, then give me life. If death is good for me, then give me death." While his family watched from a separate room, the state carried out the execution of a man whose guilt remains clouded in doubt.
Oh Allah, if life is good for me, then give me life. If death is good for me, then give me death. You know what I'm saying? So that's how I feel. You know what I'm saying? I say the same supplication. So yeah, I'm at peace, of course.
Public outcry was immediate. Over 35,000 people had signed petitions urging clemency. Religious leaders across faiths condemned the execution. Many questioned how a legal system could proceed with such irreversible punishment while forensic evidence pointed elsewhere. Missouri's choice sent a chilling message that innocence alone may not be enough to stop the machinery of death. Khalifa's son stood ready to witness his father's final moments. Despite the unbearable weight of the occasion, he spoke with strength and dignity. "I'm going to stand there firm and show my dad he's not alone," he said. "If this is the way he's going out, we already made peace."
I'm standing firm and show my dad he's not alone if this what it comes to.
What does it mean when the state values finality over truth? When the system prioritizes closure over justice? Marcellus Khalifa Williams was more than a convict. He was a father, a grandfather, a poet, an imam. If we can accept that even one innocent person can be executed, What does that say about our society? His final prayer wasn't for himself, but for us, to open our eyes and demand better. What drives a father to commit the unthinkable? In 2008, Travis James Mullis horrified the nation when he killed his 3-month-old son in Galveston, Texas. A case marked by trauma, confession, and a long road to justice. Mullis's story would end 16 years later on death row.
And convicted of killing his 3-month-old son, was executed tonight.
A man from Brazoria County near Houston set to be executed today for killing his infant son.
On January 29, 2008, after a failed attempt to molest a friend's daughter, Mullis returned to the trailer where he lived with his girlfriend and infant son, Elijah. Fearing exposure, he took Elijah for a drive to Galveston. There, parked along Seawall Boulevard, Mullis said the baby's crying pushed him past the brink. He strangled Elijah, then stomped on his head multiple times. Days later, Mullis turned himself in at a police station in Philadelphia, confessing to the murder and triggering a capital case that shocked Texas.
Travis Mullis received a lethal injection for the 2008 stomping death of his son.
Convicted in 2011, Mullis spent over a decade on Texas death row. He consistently refused to appeal, describing his sentence as assisted suicide. Defense attorneys pointed to his history of childhood sexual abuse and mental illness, but Mullis remained determined. He said justice demanded his life, and that as a Christian, he had made peace with it.
He has repeatedly waived his right to appeal, and in a final statement, he considered himself a rehabilitated man, but said, quote, "I don't regret this decision to legally expedite this process. I do regret the decision to take the life of..."
As September 24th, 2024 neared, there was no doubt left. Mullis filed no last-minute motions, spoke to no media, and rejected any intervention. He was ready. For many, it was a day long awaited. For others, it reopened wounds that never fully closed. At 7:01 p.m., Travis Mullis was pronounced dead by lethal injection in Huntsville, Texas. In his final statement, he expressed sorrow for taking his son's life, apologized to the mother, and thanked those who tried to help him. No family from either side was present. The Galveston District Attorney's Office called the crime one of the most egregious acts imaginable.
The state of Texas carried out the execution of Travis Mullis at 7:01 p.m. He gave a final statement saying that he was sorry for what he did and that he regrets the decision he made to end the life of his 3-month-old son.
I had hit my breaking point with stress, and I was scared, I was panicking, I hit my breaking point and I broke. At that point, I felt that the only way to make him to stop crying was to kill him.
The execution stirred public reflection. With 5 executions in 1 week nationwide, critics questioned the moral weight of capital punishment. Others insisted justice had been served. For Galveston, it was closure to a nightmare that had haunted the community for 16 years. Media witnesses described Mullis's final moments as calm. He winced slightly, took a few deep breaths, and fell still. There were no outbursts, no protests, just a quiet end to a life that unraveled into tragedy. Mullis winced once as the drug was injected, took 4 deep breaths, and fell still. Travis Mullis's story is a haunting collision of trauma, mental illness, and unspeakable violence. It leaves behind questions not just about justice, but about the systems and failures that shaped him. In the end, society delivered its ultimate punishment. Whether it brings peace remains for each of us to ponder. In 1992, a robbery at a convenience store in Oklahoma City would set off a legal and moral battle that would span more than 3 decades. Emmanuel Littlejohn, a man who admitted to the robbery but always denied pulling the trigger, spent over 30 years on death row. Despite conflicting accounts, a recommendation for clemency, and ongoing legal appeals, the state of Oklahoma carried out his execution in 2024. This is the story of justice, doubt, and finality.
Robbery. Emmanuel Littlejohn is scheduled to be executed on September 26th. Now, in November of 1994, he and Glenn Bethany were arrested after robbing a Root and Scoot convenience store.
Emmanuel Littlejohn and his accomplice were convicted for the killing. Littlejohn received the death penalty, which was carried out this morning at 10:17 a.m.
On the night of June 19th, 1992, Littlejohn and his accomplice, Glenn Bethany, entered the Root and Scoot convenience store to rob it. Kenneth Myers, the store manager, charged at them with a broom as they exited. One of the men turned and fired, killing Myers. But the question of who pulled the trigger would remain a point of controversy for decades. Witnesses gave conflicting reports, and there was no surveillance footage. Still, prosecutors painted Littlejohn as the shooter, and in 1994, he was sentenced to death. Bethany received life without parole.
Glenn Bethany turned around and fired the shot that killed Kenneth Myers.
For over 30 years, Emmanuel Littlejohn remained on death row, maintaining that he never killed anyone. His legal team highlighted his cognitive impairments and argued that Bethany was the actual shooter. In the final months, Littlejohn's supporters rallied. A clemency recommendation passed by a narrow 3-2 margin, but Oklahoma Governor Kevin Stitt refused to grant it. His execution moved forward, despite the shadow of doubt.
I'm the only one on death row that's been for 30 years, but I haven't killed nobody.
As the date approached, appeals were exhausted and supporters intensified their efforts. Protesters demanded a halt. Still, the machinery of death moved forward. September 26, 2024 was locked in. On the morning of September 26th, witnesses were escorted into the chamber. Littlejohn exchanged quiet goodbyes with his mother and daughter, blowing kisses through glass. At 10:17 a.m., he was pronounced dead. His final words, "I love you. I'm okay. Everything is going to be okay." Outside, officials issued statements. Governor Stitt called it justice. The Myers family, speaking through the Attorney General, expressed gratitude that the process had finally come to an end.
Littlejohn's last words consisted of a few "I love yous" to his mother and daughter, who were looking on.
The public remains divided. Some say justice was served. Others point to uncertainty, the clemency vote, and Littlejohn's mental capacity as reasons why the execution should never have happened. For many, the case has sparked renewed debates on capital punishment in America, particularly when doubt lingers.
We need you to dial this number incessantly and demand an end to this effort to execute a man who has never killed anyone.
From inside the execution chamber, reporters described an emotional scene. Littlejohn's daughter and mother sat quietly, sobbing. By 10:11 a.m., she whispered, "He's dead." No movement was seen for several minutes. At 10:17, the execution was declared complete. The silence in that room said more than any press release could.
10:11, his mother said he's dead. And there's no movement from 10:12 to 10:15.
The story of Emmanuel Littlejohn is one of tragedy, justice, and lasting questions. While one man paid with his life, others are left with doubt, grief, and unresolved pain. It's a reminder that behind every execution lies not just guilt or innocence, but a story that deserves to be heard. A man sentenced to die, a method rarely used, and a justice system tested under public scrutiny. Alan Eugene Miller's story is more than a crime. It's a clash of law, ethics, and human rights. What happens when a state tries something almost no one else has?
Alan Eugene Miller was convicted in the workplace shooting rampage that killed 3 people in 1999. This will be the second attempt to carry out Miller's execution. The Alabama Department of Corrections attempted to put Miller to death 2 years ago.
For the second time in the nation's history, nitrogen gas has been used to execute an inmate. The state of Alabama put to death convicted murderer Alan Eugene Miller on Thursday night. It is the second time this year the state has employed the controversial method.
On August 5th, 1999, Alan Miller snapped. Armed and deliberate, he executed 3 former co-workers in a calculated spree of violence across Pelham, Alabama. The shootings, allegedly triggered by delusional beliefs that colleagues were spreading rumors about him, shocked a community and sealed his fate. Within minutes, the police had him in custody. Within months, a jury would decide he should die.
Miller killed Lee Holdbrooks and Scott Yancey at one business, then drove to another location and shot Terry Jarvis.
Miller spent over 2 decades on death row, but his case took an unusual turn in 2022 when his execution by lethal injection failed. His legal team argued he had chosen nitrogen hypoxia as his method, but the state claimed his paperwork was lost. The battle that followed questioned whether the state had the right to kill someone using a method they hadn't properly prepared for. Despite the controversy, Alabama pressed forward. With federal appeals exhausted and courts permitting the execution, a date was set: September 26, 2024. The state prepared for only the second nitrogen hypoxia execution in American history. Despite the controversy, Alabama pressed forward. With federal appeals exhausted and courts permitting the execution, a date was set: September 26, 2024. The state prepared for only the second nitrogen hypoxia execution in American history. The world watched Alabama's experiment. Human rights groups condemned the method. Some argued nitrogen hypoxia was untested and torturous. Yet Attorney General Steve Marshall called it humane and effective. A battle between justice and morality reignited, and the world debated. Was this punishment or cruelty disguised as science?
That should be answered about this method before it is used again.
Witnesses in the execution chamber described a disturbing scene: shaking, gasping, silence. Valerie Bell, a media observer, recalled Miller's body tensing and pulling against the restraints for minutes. The state insisted this was expected. Others saw suffering. The truth, perhaps, lies somewhere in between gasps and silence.
Time Miller could be seen visibly shaking, trembling, and pulling at his restraints for the first 2 minutes.
The execution of Alan Eugene Miller closes one chapter, but opens many others. It leaves behind 3 victims, 1 man executed, and a country still unsure of how justice should look or feel. In the end, it forces us to ask, does a new method of death bring closure, or only a new way to question what justice really means?